There was a letter that was never sent. It was found in a battered leather satchel, folded twice, written in Jim Morrison's unmistakable handwriting, looping and urgent and pressing hard into the paper, as though the words themselves were trying to escape through the page. The envelope had no postage, no address, just a name written on the front in pencil, so softly that it had almost faded completely by the time anyone found it. Pamela. The people who read it first went quiet for a very long time, because what was inside was not what anyone expected from the man the world thought they knew. The world knew Jim Morrison as a force, as something untamable, as the leather-clad poet king of an era that burned bright and fast and left scorch marks on everything it touched. They knew the voice, deep as a canyon and twice as wide, filling arenas with it. Kind of gravity that made audiences feel simultaneously overwhelmed and finally, completely understood. They knew the presence, the way he would stand at the edge of a stage and look out at thousands of faces as though he was searching for something specific, one face, one recognition, one proof that the language he was speaking was landing somewhere real. What they did not know was the man who sat alone in a small Paris apartment in the spring of 1971, pen in hand, writing a letter he would never send. A letter that began, "I have been trying to understand what I am afraid of, and I think I finally know. But to understand what that letter meant and why it matters now, you have to go back much further than Paris. You have to go back to the beginning, to the boy before the myth, to the place where the silence came from." Jim Morrison grew up in the kind of family where feelings were managed rather than felt. His father, Steve Morrison, was a career naval officer, a man shaped by discipline and hierarchy and the belief that strength meant containment. The family moved constantly, from Georgia to Texas to New Mexico to California, following the rhythms of military life, never staying long enough in any one place for roots to form. Jim was the eldest child, and he learned early that the way to survive constant displacement was to carry your interior world with you like luggage. He read voraciously. By the time he was 12, he had worked through Nietzsche, Rimbaud, and Kerouac with the focused intensity of someone not just reading for pleasure but reading for answers. There was a moment, one Jim would later reference in interviews but never fully explain, that happened on a highway in New Mexico when he was 4 years old. The family car passed the scene of an accident, a truck that had overturned, Pueblo Indian workers scattered across the road, some of them injured. Jim stared through the back window as they drove past. His parents said nothing. The car kept moving. But Jim Morrison carried that image for the rest of his life, convinced in some deep and inarticulate way that one of those dying men had passed something into him, some fragment of soul, some burden of vision. It sounds like mythology because Jim Morrison was already turning his life into mythology, even at 4 years old. But that impulse to find transcendence in ordinary devastation, to believe that suffering carried meaning, was not a performance. It was a genuine and very private hunger. And that hunger was what nobody around him fully understood yet. He arrived at UCLA Film School in 1964 with the bearing of someone who had already decided he was important and the intelligence to back it up. His professors found him either brilliant or insufferable, and sometimes both in the same afternoon. He wrote with a density and ambition that felt out of place in classroom exercises. His short films were strange and arresting, full of long silences and images that suggested more than they explained. He was not particularly social. He lived in his notebooks. He consumed literature the way other people consumed air, constantly, urgently, as though running out was genuinely dangerous. It was at UCLA that he met Ray Manzarek, a keyboard player with a musician's ear and a philosopher's patience, who would become the closest thing Jim Morrison had to a witness. Their meeting was brief and strange, Jim reciting lyrics on a beach, Ray listening, both of them recognizing in each other some shared frequency that didn't need to be translated. That recognition would become the Doors, but the band came later. First there was just Jim, alone, filling notebooks on the rooftop of a Venice Beach building where he was living without permission, surviving on ambition and the stubborn conviction that language could do things no one had yet asked it to do. The poems he wrote during that period were not polished. They were excavations. They went places that most writers, even brave ones, pulled back from. They looked directly at death and desire and the terrifying intimacy between them, and they didn't flinch. Jim Morrison was 22 years old and already writing like someone who understood that time was not guaranteed. Whether that was vision or premonition, nobody could say for certain. But the urgency was real, and it was not manufactured for effect. The real story was never only in the music, it was in what drove him to the music in the first place. The Doors formed in 1965, and what happened next was one of the more extraordinary accelerations in rock history. They were signed, recorded, and released into a cultural moment that was hungry for exactly what Jim Morrison was offering, not just rock and roll, but something that felt philosophical, dangerous, and strangely intimate all at once. Light My Fire became an event. People Are Strange became an anthem for everyone who had ever felt like an outsider in their own life. Jim's voice was unlike anything radio had heard before, baritone and cinematic, capable of whispered confession and full-throated eruption in the same phrase, sometimes within the same line. But the stage was. Where it fully happened, Jim Morrison performing live was an experience that defied easy description. He didn't play to audiences, he interrogated them. He would stand completely still for long stretches, letting the silence get uncomfortable, and then erupt into movement or sound that released the tension like a pressure valve. He improvised lyrics in real time, following instincts that seemed to bypass rational thought entirely. He stared at individuals in the crowd with an intensity that felt invasive and illuminating simultaneously, as though he could see something in them they hadn't shown anyone else. Audiences didn't know whether to be thrilled or frightened. Most of them were both. What the audience saw was intensity. What Jim carried was something else entirely. By 1967, the band was on the cover of magazines, and Jim Morrison was on the cover of something more complicated, a story that was rapidly becoming larger than any single human being could inhabit comfortably. The cultural forces of the era were immense and overlapping. The Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the psychedelic revolution, the collapse of whatever post-war certainty had defined the previous generation. Jim was not simply riding those forces. He was embodying them, channeling something that people needed to see expressed. The problem was that embodying a cultural moment at that intensity required giving over large portions of yourself, and Jim Morrison was not always certain he had large portions to spare. The notebooks never stopped. Even as the concerts grew larger, the interviews more relentless, the expectations heavier, Jim Morrison kept writing. The poems accumulated. The observations filled pages then. More pages than entire journals. Some of it was brilliant. Some of it was raw and unfinished in ways that would require years to understand. All of it was evidence of a man who was living an almost entirely interior life even while performing an almost entirely exterior one. The gap between those two realities was not sustainable, and somewhere in 1968 it started to show. That was the moment the story became something more human. His drinking increased. The behavior on stage became less predictable, sometimes transcendent, sometimes erratic, occasionally both in the same performance. The Miami concert of 1969 became the most famous example, though accounts of what actually happened that night vary so significantly between witnesses that the truth has been buried under layers of mythology and legal aftermath. What is clear is that something shifted. After Miami, the charges, the trial, the pending sentence, all of it added a legal dimension to the already heavy weight Jim was carrying. He began to talk more openly about Paris, about wanting to go somewhere that didn't already have a Jim Morrison-shaped expectation waiting for him. Somewhere he could simply be a writer for a while, a person rather than a phenomenon. But there was something no one in the room could see, the exhaustion of being both the author and the character simultaneously. He arrived in Paris in March 1971 with Pamela Corson and a collection of notebooks and a willingness to believe that geography could provide what circumstances had not: space, silence, the possibility of starting from somewhere quieter. Paris in early spring is a city of long light and narrow streets, and the specific kind of solitude that dense cities provide when you don't know anyone and no one knows you. Jim Morrison walked those streets for hours. He visited Père Lachaise Cemetery and stood at the graves of writers and artists who had burned through their lives at similar temperatures: Proust, Balzac, Delacroix. He photographed things with a disposable camera. He filled notebooks with fragments that may or may not have been poetry, may or may not have been autobiography, the line between them having long since dissolved. He was 27 years old. He was tired in a way that sleep did not touch. He was also, by multiple accounts, more present and more articulate in private conversation during those Paris months than he had been in years. as though the removal of the stage had returned him to himself, or at least to a version of himself that had room to exist. And then, one afternoon in April, he sat down and wrote a letter. He wrote it by hand in the small apartment on Rue Beautreillis at a table near the window where the afternoon light came in at an angle that turned everything the color of old photographs. He did not write quickly. The letter took most of the afternoon. He crossed things out and rewrote them. He paused for long stretches. He was not writing a love letter exactly, though love was in it. He was writing something more like a confession, not of wrongdoing, but of interior life, of all the things he had understood too late, of the distance between who he was and who he had allowed the world to believe he was. He wrote about fear, specifically the fear that the most honest thing he had ever done was also the most invisible, the notebooks, the private poems, the 3 a.m. conversations no audience had ever witnessed. He wrote about the strange grief of being known for your surface when your depth was the thing you had always wanted to offer. He wrote about the military childhood, about his father Steve Morrison's silence, about the New Mexico highway and the Pueblo Indian workers, and the way he had been carrying that image for 23 years. He wrote about Ray Manzarek and what it meant to find one person who heard what you were actually saying underneath what you were performing. He wrote about Miami and what he had been trying to do and why it had been misunderstood, not with self-pity, but with a kind of exhausted clarity that was more painful to read than anger would have been. He wrote, near the end of the letter, "I think I have been performing the idea of freedom while actually being afraid of it. I think real freedom would have been quieter. I think I mistook volume for truth." He folded the letter twice. He wrote Pamela's name on the front in pencil. He did not give it to her. He put it in the leather satchel where he kept the most private of his notebooks, the ones that were not meant to be published, the ones that were just him, thinking on paper because thinking without paper was too fast and too unwitnessed. And that was where the distance between the man and the myth became something you could hold in your hands. Pamela Corson found the satchel after Jim died in July 1971. She did not read the letter immediately. She told a close friend, years later, that she had held the satchel for a long time before opening it, that she had known instinctively it contained something that would rearrange her understanding of the previous 4 years, and that she was not yet ready for that rearrangement. When she finally read it, she wept for a very long time, not because of grief exactly, the grief was already present, but because of recognition. Because the Jim in that letter was the Jim she had known in the quiet hours, the Jim that almost no one else had access to, the Jim that had been living alongside the famous one like a shadow that only she could see clearly. She kept the letter. She did not speak publicly about it. Pamela Corson died in 1974, and the satchel passed through several hands before its contents were eventually examined by researchers working with the Morrison estate. When scholars finally had access to the letter, the response was something close to reverence, because what the letter offered was not scandal or revelation in the tabloid sense. What it offered was interiority, the actual unperformed thought process of a man who had been performing so constantly and so completely that his inner life had become genuinely inaccessible to the people who claimed to know him best. The letter confirmed what the music had always suggested without quite saying directly, that Jim Morrison was not simply a rock star who also wrote poems. He was a poet who had found, in rock and roll, the only stage large enough to hold the scale of what he needed to express. But the stage had also distorted the expression, amplified certain frequencies while muffling others. The Jim Morrison that emerged from those amplified frequencies was both real and incomplete, a true portrait of part of a man, but only part. What people called legendary often began as something far more ordinary. A boy on a military base reading alone because the words felt like company. A young man on a beach reciting poems to Ray Manzarek because the poems needed air, a writer sitting at a window in Paris in the afternoon light, trying to say something honest for once, without the leather jacket, without the concert crowd, without the mythology pressing in from every direction, just a man and a pen and a piece of paper and the truth, finally at the end of everything, allowed to sit quietly and breathe. The letter was never meant to be a legacy document. It was meant to be a letter, but legacies rarely announce themselves. They accumulate in the margins, in the folded papers, in the things people write when they are not writing for anyone, when the audience has gone home and the stage lights have been cut and there is nothing left to perform. Jim Morrison did not want to be a myth, he wanted to be understood. The two things are not as similar as they sound. Myths are large and durable and resistant to Complexity, understanding requires the opposite: smallness, patience, the willingness to sit with contradiction rather than resolve it into something clean and portable. Jim Morrison was a man full of contradictions so fundamental that they could not be resolved, only held. He was desperate for an audience and exhausted by being seen. He was a performer of extraordinary charisma who found performance increasingly hollow. He was a poet of genuine originality who worried that the poems would be overshadowed by the persona. He was a person who wanted connection and did not always know how to receive it when it arrived. The letter is the clearest evidence of all of this, not because it resolves anything, but because it doesn't, because it sits at the end of a long and complicated life and does not attempt to summarize or justify or explain. It simply says, "Here is what I have been afraid of. Here is what I have understood too late. Here is what I would have said if I had known how to say it sooner." He didn't send it, but the letter said itself anyway. It waited in a satchel for the years it needed to wait, and then it arrived, not in the hands of the one person he wrote it for, but in the hands of everyone who had ever felt the gap between who they appeared to be and who they actually were. Everyone who had ever performed strength while privately being terrified. Everyone who had ever stood in front of people and given them something real and then gone home and wondered whether what they gave was the thing they actually meant. That recognition, that quiet, private, devastating recognition, is the reason Jim Morrison's name still carries weight half a century after the Paris apartment and the leather satchel and the folded piece of paper with a name written in pencil on the front, not because he was loud, not because he was legendary, but because underneath all of that he was trying to tell the truth about what it felt like to be human. And somewhere in the trying, even in the failing, even in the letter that never arrived, he managed to do it. The stamp was never applied, the letter was never mailed, but it reached everyone it was meant for. Jim Morrison was 27 years old when he died in Paris in July 1971. The notebooks were still full, the letter was still in the satchel, and the music was still playing in cities he had never visited for people who had not yet been born, in moments of private recognition he could not have imagined. He had wanted to be understood, in the end more than he ever knew he was.